Canada is considered one of the most culturally diverse countries in the world. According to the National Household Survey in 2011, 1 out of 5 Canadians are foreign born. And as of 2016, it has been estimated that there are about 1.8 million Chinese people living in Canada. And that makes them one of the largest ethnic groups living in the country. So it makes you wonder, how did it all begin? What made the Chinese people move here? Well, you're about to find out because in this presentation, we will be talking about the history of Chinese immigrants in Canada. During the 19th century, living conditions in China weren't the best, especially for peasants. In the rural areas, food was very scarce because as the population grew by the millions, harvest didn't yield enough to sustain most of the population. Therefore, famine spread throughout the country. Natural disasters, such as floods and droughts, also plagued the rural regions of the country. These poor living conditions sparked the beginning of the Taiping Rebellion, which lasted from 1851 to 1864 and claimed over 20 million lives across the country. The after effects of the Opium Wars in 1842 and 1860 also caused drastic rural poverty because China had to pay Great Britain a huge amount of money after losing to them. And as a result, ordinary Chinese citizens had to pay higher taxes. Because of all of these factors, China became a difficult place to live in, which resulted to many peasants deciding to leave the country and find opportunities overseas. But why Canada? Why did the Chinese people choose Canada among all countries in the world? The reason is gold! In 1858, gold was discovered along the Fraser River in British Columbia, and thousands of gold prospectors from California quickly rushed into the region. The increase in demand for labor in British Columbia led to many Chinese workers being hired to do various jobs like mining, building roads, but also supplementary jobs for the mines like cooks and laundromats. However, Caucasian miners were notorious for being violent towards Chinese miners. The Chinese miners were robbed, harassed, and even killed on some occasions as a way to drive them out of the goldfields in California. The Chinese feared similar violence happening in British Columbia, so they didn't directly compete with the Caucasian miners. However, most of the gold was found in the Cariboo region. It was here that the town of Bakerville became the first Chinese community in Canada. At the end of the gold rushes in 1870, most prospectors left the region to find work elsewhere. But the Chinese miners decided to stay and continue mining. As time passed by, gold reserves in the region decreased and so did work opportunities. But fortunately, the following year was when the British Columbia joined the Confederation and planned the construction of the CP Rail. In 1880 began the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. This work opportunity attracted thousands of Chinese workers from California and China to British Columbia. The Chinese were prize workers for many reasons. Some groups of the Chinese workers had prior experience building railways in the United States. They were also a cheap source of labor because a Chinese worker was only paid $1 a day, while a Caucasian worker was paid $1.50 to $2.50 a day. Chinese workers also worked more efficiently and were willing to do dangerous jobs like handling and using explosive nitroglycerine used to break up boulders. Due to the harsh conditions, it is estimated that 200 to 6,000 Chinese workers died from malnutrition, disease, and accidents. Finally, the construction of the British Columbia segment of the railway ended at 1885. To commemorate the achievement, CPR director Donald Alexander Smith took a photograph of himself nailing the last spike, along with the workers who helped in building the railway. Sadly, the photograph did not contain any Chinese worker because they were not allowed to be in it. As soon as the railway was completed, Canada took action to stop Chinese immigration. The Canadian government enacted the Chinese Immigration Act of 1885, which forced Chinese workers and their families to pay a head tax of $50 for each person coming into the country. Just as a reference, $50 in 1885 amounts to $1,300 today. The Chinese were the only ethnic group required to pay a fee to enter Canada. The tax was effective in the first decade, but Chinese immigration started increasing once again. In response to this, the Canadian government increased the tax to $500 in 1903. As time passed by, anti-Chinese feelings grew stronger. In July 1, 1923, the Chinese Exclusion Act completely stopped Chinese immigration into Canada. This day became known as Humiliation Day to many Chinese Canadians. Those who chose to stay in Canada faced discrimination and racism. Chinese Canadians had designated areas within the cities called Chinatowns. Prior to 1930 in Vancouver, Chinese Canadians were not allowed to buy property outside of Chinatown. Chinatowns were considered ghettos, but were actually a safe haven for Chinese Canadians to practice their culture and conduct business. The Chinese Canadians prospered despite the racist environment they faced. Between 1939 and 1945, the world went through its second largest war. China and Canada formed an alliance against Japan, who was terrorizing the Allied powers. At the end of the war, the Chinese community gained favorable coverage for their war efforts. Many groups, along with the United Nations, pressured Canada into revoking its anti-Chinese laws. As a result, the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally revoked in 1947, which allowed many Chinese Canadians to reunite with their families. And that sums up our presentation. Thanks for watching, and we hope you learned something, because it's time for some Kahoot.